A good day. I am Adeline J. Baltin of Grade 12 St. Andrew and the leader of Group 1. In this video, the researchers, my members and I will gladly present all the essential information included in our study entitled The Influence of Frustration Intolerance to the Academic Performance of the Senior High School Students of SPCB. All the presentations to be shown in this video are equally distributed to the members of the group. Chapter 1, which encompasses the background of the study up to the significance of the study, will be presented by Mr. Gabriel P. Lopez and Mr. Mark Joseph Reyes. Chapter 3, which is the methods and procedures, will be discussed by Ms. Maria Nina Ferronda. Chapter 5, Summary of Findings and its supporting analysis and interpretation of data, or the tables in Chapter 4, will be discussed by Mr. Juan Miguel Leonardo. And the conclusions in Chapter 5, which are supported by the findings, theories, and the related literature and studies, will be presented by the leader, Ms. Adeline J. Baltin.
I am Gabriel Lopez and I'll be opening Chapter 1, The Problem and Its Background. There are many instances in life where a person might be triggered by a common reaction such as frustration due to a certain circumstances. According to Johnson 2012, usually it starts with a mild, minor irritation that can often lead to frustration when the series of impediments arises. According to Berger 2005, there are many things that require the inevitability of a particular degree of frustration. It is important for people to know that there must be enough tolerance in order to attain a positive means of dealing with the trials of frustration. In another study, according to Anderson, Atiken, and Halberstadt in 2012, frustration intolerance is associated with procrastination in the academic context, to the extent that highly entitled students are also intolerant of frustration. They may also fail to thrive in accomplishing a certain academic challenge that requires unexpected effort. According to Cercia 2016, when a student is confused with a certain topic, he or she According to Cercia 2016, when a student is confused over a certain topic and is being pressured to accomplish a certain task, the resulting frustration may be because of the lack of understanding of the student or the lack of the given instruction. In another study by Tobias 2014, frustration intolerance is also called low frustration intolerance. This pertains to how an individual exhibits insufficient amount of tolerance in achieving one's goal. According to Wild 2012, frustration intolerance can also influence the academic performance of students who experience difficulties in tolerating frustration, might end up procrastinating, which can have a negative influence in the academic performance of the students. Studying can also easily be a frustrating experience. In line with the chosen variables in the study, the researchers were guided by a chosen theory named frustration aggression hypothesis, formulated by John Dullard, Neil Miller, Leonard Dobe, Orval Maurer, and Robert Sears in 1939. The theory states that when a person is held back doing a certain task, frustration can manifest in that person. The theory states that when a person gets held back in achieving a certain goal, frustration steps in. This frustration can also possibly lead to aggression. This was where the researchers got the idea of using frustration, specifically frustration intolerance, as one of the key variables in their research. The researchers paired frustration intolerance with academic performance. These variables were chosen because they wanted to look into frustration as a frequent emotion established by students when they were disrupted in accomplishing a certain school requirement. They thought about this due to their experience as students. The researchers made a study to know if the senior high school students of St. Paul College of Bukhari really get their academic performance influenced by their frustration. Rationale. The study aimed to determine the influence of frustration intolerance to the academic performance of the senior high school students of St. Paul College of Bukhari semester 2019-2020. For the statement of the main problem, does frustration intolerance influence the academic performance of the senior high school students of St. Paul College of Bukawi? The researchers aim to answer the following. What is the profile of the respondent in terms of year level and section, level of frustration intolerance, attributes of frustration intolerance, academic performance? Number 2, what is the academic performance of the student in terms of levels of frustration intolerance? 3, what is the academic performance of the student in terms of the attributes of frustration intolerance? Number 4, which attribute of frustration intolerance is the most and least prevalent among the students of SPCB? Number 5, is there a significant difference between the academic performance of the student and the level of frustration intolerance? Number 6, is there a significant difference between the academic performance of the students and the attributes of frustration intolerance? For the theoretical framework, one of the theory used was cognitive dissonance theory by Leon Festinger in the 1950s. The theory states that there can be consistency among the cognition when they seek for it. Cognitive dissonance pertains to the instance where there are conflicts of attitude, belief, and behaviors. This then ignites a feeling of discomfort from the individual. In order to lessen the feeling of discomfort, one must consider altering one of the cognitions. Another theory used was Maslach burnout theory, was a theory proposed by Christian Maslach, Susan Jackson, and Michael Later in 1981. The theory states that burnout is defined as a state of chronic stress and frustration that can lead to physical and emotional exhaustion. This can also happen when the person is cynical in his or her capability in performing a certain task and feels detached to the certain task at hand. This can trigger lack of personal accomplishment because there is a decrease in self-competence and self-achievement. One of the theories includes frustration aggression theory. After the first formulation of the hypothesis in 1939, 2 years later in 1941, Miller and Sears had the chance to reformulate the hypothesis and state that frustration produces instigation to a different type of response, one of which is aggression. In relation to the study, the theories were connected in line with the academic performance of the students in a way when a goal of finishing a certain task was interrupted or blocked, there was also frustration. In some serious cases, these students who are having a hard time may also exhibit aggression. When an individual does not feel determined to accomplish a certain task, serious frustration can occur and trigger burnouts to show an impact to the level of productivity and frustration tolerance of the student. For the conceptual framework, the input, profile of the respondents in terms of year, level of and section, level of frustration intolerance, the attributes of frustration intolerance, and the academic performance. For the levels of frustration intolerance, we have emotional intolerance, entitlement, discomfort intolerance, achievement. Attributes of frustration intolerance ranging from strong, very strong, moderate, mild, and absent. And the rating for the academic performance would be outstanding, 90 to 100, very satisfactory, 85 to 89, satisfactory, 80 to 84, fairly satisfactory, 75 to 79, did not meet expectations, below 70. The process used was quasi-experimental And a research design is a standardized test using the frustration discomfort scale developed by Neil Harrington in 2005. Analysis of the academic performance using the first semester GPA of the senior high school students for the output, that is the influence of frustration intolerance to the academic performance of senior high school students in SPCB year 2019-2020.
Hi, I'm Mark Joseph L. Reyes of Group 1, the research title of The Influence of Frustration Intolerance to the Academic Performance of the Senior High School Students of St. Paul College of Bukhari. I am going to discuss our research hypothesis, the definition of terms, and the scope and the limitation. Our study has two sets of hypotheses. First set, there is no significant difference between the academic performance of students and the level of frustration intolerance. The alternative hypothesis is that there is a significant difference between the academic performance of the students and the level of frustration intolerance. The second set, our null, is that there is no significant difference between the academic performance of the students and the attributes of frustration intolerance. And our alternative hypothesis, there is a significant difference between the academic performance of the students and the attributes of frustration intolerance, in which this set of hypotheses in this study aims to prove that there is no significant difference between the academic performance of the students and the levels of frustration intolerance, and there is no significant difference between the academic performance of the students and the attributes of frustration intolerance. Definition of terms, the researchers define the variables of the study, which is the academic performance and the frustration intolerance. The researchers also defined the four attributes in Neil Harrington's frustration discomfort scale, namely emotional intolerance, entitlement, discomfort intolerance, and achievement. Academic performance is conceptually defined as how the students meet the standards set out by an educational institution by Bamidil 2017. In addition, it also refers as to how well the student excels in academics. Academic performance is operationally defined by the first semester grade point average of the senior high school students. Frustration intolerance is conceptually defined when an individual finds it difficult to accept things that doesn't go according to plan or their expectation. Chippy et al. 2012. It has four subskills, which consist of emotional intolerance, entitlement, discomfort intolerance, and achievement. According to Wild 2012, emotional intolerance is the belief that experiencing emotional distress is unbearable and must be avoided or controlled. Branch and Dryden 2008 defined entitlement as the intolerance of unfairness and frustration over not receiving gratification when a desire has been achieved. Discomfort intolerance was defined by Smith 2006 as an individual difference in the capacity to tolerate unpleasant and uncontrollable bodily sensation. Lastly, achievement was defined as the progress and result in learning educational experiences that the individual indicate in relation with his or her educational study is Nian 2009. Frustration intolerance was operationally defined by quantifying Neil Harrington's frustration discomfort scale in 2005, which measures the frustration intolerance of the students. Each subscale consists of 7 items in the questionnaire. This study will greatly benefit the following. For the students, they may be able to understand and have a wider knowledge about frustration tolerance, especially when dealing with their academic responsibilities. For the teachers, they may use this study to give them further background on how and why students experience frustration and help them to increase their frustration tolerance in order to perform better with their academics. For this, for the parents, they may use this study to further understand and assess their children who are facing frustration and to have a proper knowledge to help their children cope with frustration. For the school administration, this study may help them understand the problems that the students are experiencing when handling frustration. And also, this study may be used as a tool to conduct seminars and programs on how to enhance the students' frustration intolerance. Now, the scope and the limitation of this study are the following. The levels of frustration was limited into very strong, strong, moderate, mild, and absent, while the attribute under frustration intolerance was limited only with emotional intolerance, entitlement, discomfort intolerance, and achievement. Academic performance was also limited to the first semester GPAs of the students in line with the following attributes: outstanding, very satisfactory, satisfactory, and fairly satisfactory, and did not meet expectations. And also, the respondents were also limited into the senior high school students of St. Paul College of Pukawe, in which is the grade 11 and grade 12 students. The reason why the researchers chose grade 11 students is because they're in the coping stage of the senior high program of the government. And the reason why the researchers chose grade 12 is because of the workload and the amount of tasks given to grade 12 students. That is all.
Good day. My name is Maranine Efranda from Group 1 and I'm going to discuss the Chapter 3, Methods and Procedure. For the research design, the researchers used quasi-experimental design, and it helped the research to determine the influence of frustration intolerance to the academic performance of the senior high school students. The researchers used simple random sampling method through the use of Slovine's formula. And now, I will show you what Slovine's formula looks like. This is what Slovine's formula looks like. N equals N over open close 1 plus N times the margin of error raised to 2 equals the answer. N, which means the number of all the respondents, and E means the margin of error, which is 0.05. Now, let us use this formula to compute the respondents of the senior high school students. N equals 275 which is the overall total of grades 11 and 12, over open close 1 plus 265 times the margin of error, which is 0.05, raised to 2. The answer is 462.96. The sample size was originally equated to 162 respondents. It increased to 163 because of the decimals that were considered as one respondent. Since the researchers wanted to have equal distributions from each section, both in the grades 11 and 12, they made the number of respondents into 168. They divided it into 2 to determine how many respondents were needed per level, which then resulted into 84. From the 84 respondents, 21 students were randomly picked per section to participate. Here is the frequency and percentage distribution of the grade 11 students. Frequency and percentage distribution of the grade 12 students. The frequency and percentage distribution of the senior high school students, both grade 11 and grade 12. Here is the code scale and verbal interpretation of frustration intolerance. And lastly, this is the code scale and verbal interpretation of academic performance. For the research instrument, the researchers used a standardized questionnaire named Frustration Discomfort Scale, formulated by Neil Harrington in 2005. It is used to determine the frustration intolerance of a student or a person. The researchers used a 5-point Likert scale type: 1 for absent, 2 for mild, 3 for moderate, 4 for strong, and 5 for very strong. And it has 4 subscales: emotional intolerance, entitlement, discomfort intolerance, and achievement. For the data gathering procedure, the researchers needed to acquire their first semester grade point average or GPA of all senior high school students. They specifically mentioned the class numbers of their respondents within the letter addressed to the academic chairman and class advisors. By choosing the class number, the researchers asked for the even class numbers. Picking a student with an odd class number was only necessary when there were no students with an even class number anymore. And for the statistical treatment, the researchers used one-way ANOVA to determine the significant difference of the academic performance of the respondents in terms of the levels and attributes of frustration intolerance.
Good morning, everyone. I am Juan Miguel Leonardo, and I will be discussing the summary of findings of our study. So the researchers sought the answers for the specific problem in their study. For the first specific problem, what is the profile of the senior high school respondents in terms of A. Year 11 section. So in terms of year 11 section, we will be using this table, frequency and percentage distribution of the senior high school students. So there were equal distributions among the respondents, with 84 or 50% of them in each grade level. Next, in terms of attributes of frustration intolerance, we will be using this table, frequency and percentage distribution of the attributes of frustration intolerance of the senior high school respondents according to year level. So the senior high school respondents had the highest percentage on discomfort intolerance, which is 27.98%, and the lowest percentage on the emotional intolerance, which is 11.31%. So the next specific problem. What is the academic performance of the students in terms of levels of frustration intolerance? So we will be using this table. Weighted mean of academic performance according to the levels of frustration intolerance. The highest academic performance was from the respondent who had an absent level which is 85 GPA, and the lowest academic performance were from the respondents who have very strong frustration intolerance, which is 82.25 GPA. For the next specific problem, which attribute of frustration intolerance is the most and least prevalent among the students? So for this specific problem, we will be using this table. Frequency and percentage distribution of the attributes of frustration intolerance of the senior high school respondents according to year level. So the most prevalent attribute of frustration intolerance is discomfort intolerance, which is 27.98%, and the least prevalent attribute is emotional intolerance, which is 11.31%. Next specific problem is there a significant difference between the academic performance of the students and the levels of frustration intolerance? For this specific problem, we will be using this table, one-way analysis of variance of the academic performance of the senior high school students in terms of the levels of frustration intolerance. Since we got the p-value of 0.9999975, and it is greater than the margin of error, which is 0.05, therefore, we accepted the null hypothesis that there is no significant difference between the academic performance of the students and the levels of frustration intolerance. Next specific problem is there a significant difference between the academic performance of the students and the attributes of frustration intolerance? So for this specific problem, we will be using this table, one-way analysis of variance of the academic performance of the senior high school students in terms of the attributes of frustration intolerance. Since we got the p-value of 0.999975 and it is greater than the margin of error, which is 0.05, therefore we accepted the null hypothesis that there is no significant difference between the academic performance of the students and the attributes of frustration intolerance. Now, the main problem. Does frustration intolerance have an influence to the academic performance of the senior high school students of St. Paul College of Bukawi? Since there is no significant difference between the academic performance of the students and the levels of frustration intolerance, and academic performance of the students and the attributes of frustration intolerance, therefore we accepted the null hypothesis that frustration intolerance has no influence to the academic performance of the senior high school students of St. Paul College of Bukawi.
I am Adeline J. Balbin, and for this part of the video, I am going to state all the conclusions formulated by the researchers, as well as their gathered literature, studies, and theories which were used in order to support their conclusions. Conclusion number 1. Most of the senior high school students of St. Paul College of Bukawi have a moderate frustration intolerance. In the researchers' discussion as to support conclusion number 1, they included an article by Maureen 2020 which states that frustration can be tolerated. When a person tries hard enough and dedicates his or her time to decrease his or her level of frustration, he or she can learn to express himself or herself in socially mannered ways. This seeks proof that frustration can be tolerated. There can be ways to decrease one's level of frustration if a person tries hard enough and practices. In the case of the senior high school students of SPCB, 92 out of 168 respondents have a moderate frustration intolerance. These students, although faced with situations that stimulate frustration, they also have the capacity to regulate their frustration moderately. Another supporting discussion for conclusion number 1 is a study conducted by FATMA 2019 entitled Role Frustration and Anxiety Among Adolescents. In the study, there were 300 respondents from 6 schools in Lanao City in India. And the respondents were further divided into the social classes, the high class, the middle class, and the lower class. And each of them had 50 respondents. From the results, it was indicated that adolescents were experiencing a moderate level of frustration intolerance. This can be connected to conclusion number 1 because most of the senior high school students of SPCB are also adolescents with a moderate frustration intolerance. Conclusion number 2. Most of the senior high school students of St. Paul College of Bukawi have a very satisfactory academic performance. In an article made by Garcia 2017, It was discussed that there were various factors contributing to the academic performance of the students. It includes students themselves when they partake on making a good choice to do good in their studies and how it can lead to a high academic performance. Garcia stated that students themselves can be factors in contributing to a high academic performance. So these students, when they choose to do good and choose to excel in their grades, then eventually they can garner a very satisfactory academic performance. This is related to the study in a way that the students were able to have a choice to manage a moderate frustration intolerance without having to let their academic performances be affected. So the students can have a choice on how they can cope up with their studies if they want to do good or if they want to do better, if they don't want to excel, then the choice they made will have a resulting effect. And the resulting effect of doing good is having a very satisfactory academic performance. Conclusion number 3. The most prevalent attribute of frustration intolerance among the senior high school students of St. Paul College of Bukawi is discomfort intolerance. For conclusion number 3, the researchers chose one of their 3 guiding theories, and it was cognitive dissonance theory proposed by Leon Festinger in the 1950s. The theory stated that cognitive dissonance pertains to instances wherein there are conflicts in attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. This then ignites a feeling of discomfort from the individual. In order to connect cognitive dissonance theory to conclusion number 3, we must first go back to the conceptual definition of discomfort intolerance. And so, what is discomfort intolerance? According to Anastis and Pennings, 2013, it is the inability to tolerate difficulties and hassles in life. According to Schmid, 2006, it is an individual difference in the capacity to tolerate unpleasant and uncomfortable bodily sensations. And according to Will, 2012, it stems from the way of thinking that life should be comfortable and should not in any way involve having to experience struggles. So in general, what discomfort intolerance means is when a person cannot handle having to experience difficulties or hassles in life. This can be related to Festinger's cognitive dissonance theory, wherein there is a feeling of discomfort experienced by an individual because there is a conflict between the attitudes, beliefs, behaviors that can cause a dilemma in handling various challenges. Now, in a student's perspective, of course, there are piled up requirements, all the written tasks, the performance tasks, the homeworks, and everything that a student needs to fulfill. And thinking of that can create a feeling of discomfort because it can create a dilemma in handling various challenges. Conclusion number 4. The least prevalent attribute of frustration intolerance among the senior high school students of St. Paul College of Bukawi is emotional intolerance. As a support to conclusion number 4, the researchers found a study conducted by Abstatio 2013 entitled Self-Control and Well-Being, the Moderating Roles of Frustration Intolerance and Emotional Intensity. The study involved 299 individuals with 233 males and 66 males from undergraduate psychology courses of Tennessee University and various websites in the World Wide Web. There were many measures used. One of it included the frustration discomfort scale. The purpose of the research was to know how self-control, emotional intensity, and frustration intolerance contributed together in influencing one's well-being. The results included that individuals with higher levels of self-control are more positive and do not dwell much on negative emotions. It was indicated in the results that those with higher self-control are also the ones with higher emotional stability. Thus, they are most likely the ones to be more positive and less emotional. This gives support to conclusion number 4 of the researchers that emotional intolerance is the least prevalent attribute. Only 19 out of 168 of the respondents were high on emotional intolerance, leaving the remaining ones who were higher on other attributes. These remaining individuals have a higher self-control, making the attribute of emotional intolerance as the least prevalent among the students. According to Salter's Speed Neal 2019, Emotions are not indefinite, so people have the capacity to regulate it and monitor how intense it can be. It usually happens when there is a goal to be achieved or we want something to work out. For example, when a person's boss does not treat him or her well at work, he or she chooses to not bother with it because he or she has the goal of getting promoted. Take for example, in an academic context. A student gets a low grade. But instead of acting on a slump or being emotional over it, he or she chooses to not dwell on it and chooses to do better next time. People have the capacity to choose how to act in a situation. Emotions can be identified, so it is easier for people to tolerate or control it. According to Lyons 2018, when people learn to recognize their emotions and tolerate disturbing feelings, they can be quicker to recover. The longer they try to understand their feelings, the better they will be to do so and be comfortable enough to move on. Once people are able to recognize and understand their own emotions, it will be easier for them to shrug it off. When emotions are realized, it gets easier for them to control it, making them more tolerant to handling emotions. Conclusion number 5. Frustration intolerance does not have an influence to the academic performance of the senior high school students of St. Paul College of Bukawi. Based from the results gathered by the researchers, they found out that the null hypothesis is accepted, which means that the academic performance of the students has no significant difference in terms of the levels and attributes of frustration intolerance. The researchers were able to formulate 2 hypotheses for their study. Hypothesis 1, which states that there is no significant difference between the academic performance of the students and the levels of frustration intolerance. And Hypothesis 2, which states that there is no significant difference between the academic performance of the students and the attributes of frustration intolerance, were the researchers' indicators of identifying whether frustration intolerance has a significant influence to the academic performance of the students. Both the levels and the attributes of frustration intolerance do not have a significant difference between the academic performance of the students. Therefore, frustration intolerance does not have an influence to the academic performance of the senior high school students of St. Paul College of Bukawi. As a support for the conclusion, the researchers found a study conducted by De Mello, Lemon, and Persson 2009 entitled Antecedent-Consequent Relationships and Cyclical Patterns Between Affective States and Problem-Solving Outcomes. They concluded that frustration does not have negative effects like boredom and anxiety on one's learning. Further supporting the concept is that boredom and not frustration is the most damaging to learning. The study itself was a more complex one because it comprised of different variables such as the affective states, the basic emotions, and the neutral emotions. However, the researchers focused on one of their conclusions, that frustration is not detrimental to one's learning. Furthermore, it was discussed in their study that instead of frustration, boredom is the most detrimental or damaging to one's learning. In general, since most of the senior high school students of St. Paul College of Bukawi have a moderate frustration intolerance, they have the capacity to control and regulate their frustration, which enable them to do well in school and garner a very satisfactory academic performance.
Once again, I am Gabriel Lopez for Chapter 5 Recommendations. The researchers would like to recommend to further work on determining if frustration intolerance has an influence on the academic performance of the students if they include the data on having a combination of prevalent attributes. In their study, they did not anticipate the respondents to gain more than one prevalent attribute. The researchers were able to provide a table showing the combination of the attributes of frustration intolerance that some of the respondents have as their most prevalent. However, they only focus on the respondents having a single prevalent attribute. The researchers would like to recommend to the administration to have seminars or counseling sessions that will further discuss and implement ways on how the students can be aware of their frustration and how they can lessen their frustration. As for the students, the researchers would like to recommend to the students with a high level of frustration intolerance to find ways to tolerate their frustration. Students must also be aware of their most and least prevalent attribute of frustration intolerance in order to have a better understanding on how they can prevent or reduce their frustration intolerance.
And that concludes our video presentation about our study entitled The Influence of Frustration Intolerance to the Academic Performance of the Senior High School Students of SPCB. Again, I am Adeline J. Balbin of Grade 12 St. Andrew and leader of Group 1. Thank you.